Just a nurse. That's what they whispered when Katie Rodriguez passed through the hallway, her footsteps a quiet rhythm against the tile floor of Mercy General, the fluorescent lights above humming their endless mechanical song. Just a nurse with steady hands and a slight limp that made her seem smaller than she was, more deferential, easier to overlook. They didn't know. Not yet. The combat boots hidden at the bottom of her locker, caked with Iraqi dust from 3 tours, told a different story, one she'd learned to keep silent, buried under 18 months of antiseptic smells and careful anonymity in Savannah. The third-floor hallway of Mercy General moved with its usual morning rhythm as Katie pushed the medication cart forward, her badge clipped to her scrubs catching the fluorescent glare. It was 6:24 a.m. on a Tuesday. The kind of morning when the hospital still felt like it belonged to the night shift, the world not quite awake. She passed the nurses' station where 2 residents stood arguing about an order, their voices sharp with the exhaustion of a 28-hour shift. Neither of them acknowledged her? That was fine. Acknowledgement had never been part of her plan. 18 months of becoming invisible in a city where nobody asked questions meant she could move through these corridors like water, present, essential, unremarkable. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the kind of defeat that came from a 12-hour shift stretching into 14. Katie sat alone at the corner table, her trembling hands wrapped around a ceramic mug, the coffee inside still steaming. She took a breath. A single measured breath, the kind that came from training, from years of learning that control was oxygen. The trembling stopped. It always did. Her fingers steadied against the warm ceramic, and she stared at the dark liquid inside, watching her reflection ripple across the surface. Her phone buzzed. Another text from her son, Danny, now 18 and asking the same question he'd been asking for months, working late again. She typed back one word. Always. That word wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. The whole truth was that she worked late because being at home meant sitting in the small apartment where the walls held too much silence, where her son looked at her with the kind of curiosity that made her chest tighten. He believed she'd worked desk jobs before nursing school, some administrative position that required nothing but paperwork and patience. It was a story she'd built carefully, brick by brick, a story that let him sleep at night believing his mother was ordinary. He didn't know his commanding officer from deployment, Master Sergeant Chen, a man she'd never met but whose name she knew because Danny had mentioned him exactly once, had sent her boy home in one piece. He didn't know why that mattered. He didn't know anything about the part of her that lived in Tikrit, the part that refused to fully leave, even now. The door to the break room opened, and Katie's back straightened slightly. 2 nurses entered, both from the day shift, both in their early 30s, both radiating the kind of camaraderie that came from shared history. They didn't look at Katie as they moved to the refrigerator, didn't acknowledge her with the small nod that might have suggested she was a person worth knowing. She'd learned not to expect that. New hires from nowhere with mysterious pasts and careful smiles were not built for inclusion. The taller nurse laughed at something the other said, and the sound echoed in the break room like a door closing. Katie finished her coffee in silence, rinsed the mug, and walked back out into the hallway. By 7:15 a.m., the 3rd floor of Mercy General had fully woken up. The night shift was handing off to day shift, a choreography of reports and vital signs and the kind of medical shorthand that sounded like music to anyone who'd spent enough time in hospitals. Katie moved through it all with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory, the muscle memory of someone who'd done far worse than place fours in poorly lit conditions. She was approaching room 312, a post-operative patient who needed a peripheral line replaced, when she felt the shift in the air. The way a room changes when someone important enters it. Dr. James Hargrove, 52 years old, silver-haired in the way that comes from expensive genetics and careful grooming, walked through the hallway with his white coat trailing behind him like a flag. His presence made the fluorescent lights seem dimmer, or maybe that was just the effect he had on people, the way certain men could make a room feel smaller. He was already barking orders at a resident, his voice carrying the specific quality of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The resident, a woman who looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days, nodded frantically, her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. Katie didn't look at him as he passed. Looking would have been a mistake. Instead, she focused on the 4 lines she was prepping, her hands moving with a kind of automatic precision that came from practice, 14 years of practice, though Dr. Hargrove would never know that. Her fingers found the catheter by touch alone, her other hand steadying the patient's arm with just enough pressure to make the vein pop. 18 gauge. Clean insertion. She'd placed 3,004s in her life, probably more, but that number didn't matter here. Here, at Mercy General in Savannah, she was just the new nurse with the limp who'd arrived 18 months ago with no history and a desire to be left alone. The four slid in, the flash of blood in the hub, the steady flow of the saline lock confirming placement. Perfect. The patient, a woman in her 60s recovering from a hip replacement, didn't even flinch. Katie had a gift for making people unaware of pain, for moving through their discomfort like it was something she could push aside with the sheer force of competence. She taped the line down, checked the dressing, and moved on to the next room without a word. By noon, Katie had placed 8 4s, restocked 2 medication carts, and responded to 2 call lights with the kind of attentiveness that made patients feel seen without making her feel present. This was her skill, being useful without being known. The slight limp from a bullet wound that had shattered her femur 4 years ago in Tikrit, a wound that was supposed to end her career, that did end her Navy career, was invisible if you didn't know to look for it. She'd learned to walk through it, learned to make the pain into information instead of complaint. Pain was data. Data was something to be processed and filed and used. She was in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, reorganizing the stock of saline flushes and medication vials, when her phone buzzed again. Another message from Danny, got my lunch in the car, heading to school. She should eat something. The concern in those words made her throat tight. She typed back, have a good day. That was all she could manage. The supply closet was small and windowless, the fluorescent light flickering in a pattern that was supposed to be soothing but felt like a countdown. Katie steadied the boxes of 4 supplies, her movements methodical, her breathing controlled. In here, alone, she didn't have to pretend. Alone, she could let her hand shake for just a moment, could press her palm against the scar on her left forearm, a map of shrapnel and infection and the kind of healing that never truly finished, and remember what it felt like to be someone other than just a nurse. But that moment lasted only seconds. She heard footsteps in the hallway outside, and by the time the supply closet door opened, Katie had already rearranged her face into something neutral, something deferential, something that belonged to a nurse who worked desk jobs before coming here. The ambulance bay doors of Mercy General opened at 1:43 p.m., and the first thing Katie heard was the siren dying into that final whine that meant arrival. She was in the hallway, checking on a post-operative patient's drain output, when the commotion started. The alert came through the overhead speaker, trauma activation, respiratory distress, vehicle to Bay 4. The hallway suddenly filled with purpose, with nurses moving like schools of fish responding to a current, all of them flowing toward the emergency department. Katie had learned not to involve herself in traumas unless she was specifically called. New nurses didn't push into bays uninvited. New nurses didn't assert themselves into the territory of the veteran trauma team. So she stayed in the hallway, finishing her assessment of the drain output, pink-tinged, reasonable flow, consistent with post-op expectation, and was about to document in the patient's chart when she checked the admission screen. The name made her freeze. Literally froze, her fingers mid-keystroke, her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. Master Sergeant Chen. Disabled veteran. Respiratory distress. Complications from Tikrit injuries. Status post-surgical intervention for traumatic pneumothorax 2 years prior. Currently presenting with labored breathing, asymmetric chest expansion, negative breath sounds on right side. Katie's coffee cup, the one she'd rinsed in the break room hours ago, would have fallen from her hands if she'd been holding it. Instead, it was her breath that fell, somewhere inside her, landing in a place where it would take a long time to be found again. Master Sergeant Chen. The man who'd sent her son home from deployment. The man whose command Danny had served under. The man Katie had never met but whose name was written into her son's survival in a way that made her owe him something she couldn't name. She moved toward the trauma bay without deciding to move, her feet carrying her forward on their own, muscle memory taking over. The doors to Bay 4 were open, and she could see the gurney, could see the patient, a man in his mid-50s with the kind of bearing that came from decades of military service, his chest rising and falling in that desperate pattern that meant the lungs were working against him instead of for him. His wife stood to the side, her face tight with the kind of fear that comes from knowing your husband's body has already betrayed him once. Their daughter stood beside her, younger but holding the same tension. Dr. Hargrove was already there, already giving orders, already making the trauma bay feel like it belonged to him in a way that suggested he'd never once doubted his right to be anywhere. Katie stood in the doorway, watching, her hands by her sides, her posture making herself smaller. Just a nurse. Just the new one with the limp who nobody needed to know anything about. Just the woman who worked late and kept to herself and had combat boots hidden in a locker on the 3rd floor, caked with dust from a place that had tried to kill her and failed. But her eyes, her very trained eyes, were already reading the patient. Asymmetric chest expansion. The right side barely moving. Negative breath sounds on right lower lobe. The oxygen saturation on the monitor was 89 and dropping. The breathing pattern was shallow, desperate, the kind that said the lungs were filling with something, air, blood, fluid, something that didn't belong. A tension pneumothorax. She could see it without touching him, could read his body like a diagnostic manual. That's what 3 combat tours taught you, how to read injury when there wasn't time for fancy equipment, when the only thing keeping someone alive was your ability to know what you were looking at before the body quit trying. What happened next didn't just change the trajectory of her shift. What happened next ended everything she'd spent 18 months building, everything she'd carefully constructed to keep the world from knowing what slept inside her. Master Sergeant Chen lay on the gurney with his wife on one side and his adult daughter on the other, his breathing coming in sharp, rapid pulls that filled the trauma bay with a sound like wind through a broken window. His left leg ended below the knee, a reminder of Tikrit that he'd learned to walk through, but tonight something else was failing. His chest rose asymmetrically. His lips held a faint blue tint. Katie approached with the vital signs monitor, and the moment his eyes found hers, recognition flickered across his face, not surprise, but something deeper. Confirmation. She knew him. More importantly, he knew she had a son. He knew because he'd commanded that son through 3 rotations in Helmand province. He'd sent Danny home with all his pieces intact. Katie's hands moved through the assessment with the precision of someone who'd done this before, though never in scrubs, never in a hospital with fluorescent lights humming overhead like mechanized insects. She noted his accessory muscle use, the way his neck veins distended with each breath, the subtle tracheal deviation toward the right side of his neck. The pattern was unmistakable. Tension pneumothorax, air trapped between his lung and chest wall, pressure building with each breath, collapsing the lung from the inside out. Dr. Hargrove entered the trauma bay with the confidence of a man who'd never been questioned in his own domain. He was tall, silver-haired, the kind of doctor whose white coat had been pressed that morning by someone else's hands. He glanced at the monitor, then at Katie. Rodriguez, vitals, and leave. The real clinicians will handle this. Katie hesitated. The hesitation lasted 3 seconds, long enough for Chen's daughter to notice, long enough for the room's energy to shift. Doctor, his breathing pattern suggests possible tension pneumothorax. His accessory muscles are. Suggests you're overeager, Nurse Rodriguez. Hargrove's voice carried the weight of institutional authority, the kind of power that came from being right so many times that being wrong felt impossible. Learn your place before diagnosing above your pay grade. The words landed in the room like dropped glass. Chen's daughter stared at Katie with an expression that mixed pity and embarrassment. Katie took one measured breath. Her jaw tightened. One tear escaped without permission, not from sadness, but from the pressure of holding everything down, everything in. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her composure returning like a door sliding shut. She nodded once and left the bay, but not before Chen's eyes found hers again, a question in them, and something that looked like apology. 2 hours later, Katie returned with his lab results, a folder that told the story Hargrove had refused to hear. Elevated white blood cell count. Metabolic acidosis beginning. Chest X-ray pending, but the clinical picture was screaming. Hargrove stood at the bedside updating Chen's family on his stable condition, a phrase that tasted like copper to anyone who understood what was actually happening inside that trauma bay. Doctor, his white count is elevated and he's using accessory muscles. His O2 saturation is trending downward. 84% on room air. Katie's voice was clinical, controlled, the voice of someone trained to deliver information under fire. Hargrove laughed. Actually laughed, the sound of it sharp and dismissive. Did nursing school teach you to read labs now, clipboard? The nickname landed with surgical precision. Chen's wife looked away. Katie's jaw tightened again, a muscle working beneath the surface. One tear escaped. She wiped it without looking away, said quietly, "A pattern is forming, doctor," and Hargrove's face purpled in a way that suggested he understood exactly what she meant. Out. Now. The break room at lunch was the kind of place where hospital staff pretended normalcy didn't break down at the edges, where the coffee was always slightly too bitter and the microwave smelled like someone else's regrets. Katie pushed open the door to find 3 nurses, Sharon, Miguel, and Beth, sitting at the vinyl table with their lunch containers spread before them like small civilizations. They saw her. Their eyes met hers for exactly 1 second, just long enough to exchange the kind of glance that communicated surrender. They weren't defending her. They were protecting themselves. The calculus in hospital hierarchies was simple: stand with the nurse and face the attending physician, or distance yourself and survive the shift. They gathered their lunches in perfect synchronization. No one spoke. No one made eye contact a second time. They simply left, the door swinging shut with a whisper. Katie sat at the empty table. She opened her lunch, a sandwich her son had made that morning, turkey and mustard on wheat, and did not eat. The fluorescent light above flickered. Flickered again. Once more. Then settled into its mechanical hum, indifferent to whether anyone was listening. That afternoon, something shifted in the hospital's nervous system. Hargrove posted a formal disciplinary notice on the unit board, the header printed in red like a warning: Rodriguez, insubordination and scope violations. Katie was restocking supplies at the nurse's station when he began reading it aloud, his voice carrying to every corner of the corridor where staff moved like iron filings around a magnet. 12 people within earshot. All of them listening. Nurse Rodriguez has repeatedly attempted to diagnose above her qualifications, undermining physician authority and jeopardizing patient safety. This constitutes a serious breach of professional boundaries and nursing ethics. Documentation and formal investigation to follow. Katie's hands paused on a gauze box. White cotton, individually wrapped, sterile, ready to absorb blood or sweat or saline. Sharon whispered something to Miguel that Katie didn't quite catch, but the tone traveled clearly: judgment. Finality. Hargrove turned to her, his silver hair catching the overhead light. "Do you have something to say, Rodriguez?" She took one measured breath. The kind of breath they taught you in combat training, in the moments before everything changed. She let the silence sit for 2 seconds, then 3. One tear escaped, not from fear, but from the accumulated weight of 18 months of staying invisible, of holding down everything she'd been, everything she could do. She wiped it with her index finger without breaking eye contact. "A patient is dying, doctor, and you're protecting your ego." The nurse's station went absolutely still. The kind of silence that happens when someone has said the thing no one is supposed to say. The thing that shatters the careful fiction of institutional hierarchy. Hargrove's face shifted through several colors, red to purple to a white so pale it looked like he'd been drained of blood. His hand moved toward his phone with the kind of deliberate slowness that suggested he was about to make a call that would change everything. That night, at 2:02 a.m., Katie checked on Master Sergeant Chen during her rounds. His oxygen saturation had dropped to 88%. His breathing was rapid and shallow, the respirations of someone running out of time. His chest wall moved asymmetrically, left side expanded with each breath, right side lagging as if trapped beneath glass. There was tracheal deviation, subtle but unmistakable if you knew what to look for. Tension pneumothorax. The air that had escaped from his lung was pressurizing against his heart, collapsing it from the inside. The kind of thing that killed you in minutes if no one understood what was happening. Katie hit the code button. The response time from here was for minutes minimum. Code blue announcements would take 30 seconds. Team assembly another 90. Chen's oxygen saturation dropped to 82%. His lips were turning the color of old bruises. His eyes found hers across the darkened monitor screen, and something shifted in his expression, not panic, but recognition. He whispered something, his voice the sound of a man running out of oxygen. You're Danny's mom. She froze. For 2 seconds, 3 seconds, the world held its breath. He knew. He knew who she was. He knew she had a son. He knew that son had served under him and come home alive because of him, because of the decisions he'd made in a war zone where teenagers became soldiers and soldiers became ghosts. His SATs dropped to 79%. Katie made the choice that would end everything she'd built. From the crash cart beside the bed, she grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle. No time for sterile protocol. No time for permission. Her hands palpated his second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The anatomical landmark came back to her like muscle memory, like something her body had never forgotten even when her mind had tried to bury it. This is going to hurt, Sergeant. She inserted the needle. The hiss of pressurized air escaping was like a sigh of relief. Chen gasped. His color returned within seconds. His oxygen saturation climbed, 88, 91, 94. The procedure took 90 seconds. She'd done it before in sandstorms with sand coating her teeth, with bullets overhead, with helicopters screaming toward her position. This was just the muscle memory of someone who'd learned medicine in places where the alternative to knowing was death. Dr. Hargrove arrived with the code team to find Katie standing over the patient, the catheter still in her hand, Chen breathing normally, the crisis resolved in the span of time it took most people to decide what they wanted for lunch. Hargrove's face went white, then red, the colors cycling like a warning beacon. What the hell did you do? Katie's voice was steady, the voice of a different person than the one who'd wiped away tears that afternoon. Needle decompression. Tension pneumothorax. He would have died in 3 minutes. Hargrove's hand shook, not from relief, but from rage, from the understanding that something had just slipped out of his control. Chen's wife clutched Katie's arm, tears streaming down her face. You saved him. You saved my husband. Hargrove pulled Katie into the hallway with the kind of force that suggested he'd forgotten she might pull back. You just performed a procedure outside your scope. You're done. His voice was a whisper, the kind of whisper that carries more weight than screaming. I'm calling the board. I'm calling state licensing. You just ended your career, Rodriguez. Katie stood in the fluorescent hallway outside Trauma Bay 3, aware that her entire 18 months of carefully constructed invisibility had just exploded into something that could never be put back together. She didn't respond. She didn't defend herself. She simply nodded, because she understood something Hargrove didn't yet, that sometimes the choice between staying hidden and saving a life isn't actually a choice at all. The monitor beside Master Sergeant Chen's bed beeped in steady rhythm. Katie moved through the darkened ICU with the silence of someone trained to walk through rooms without disturbing them, checking vitals on 3 other patients before she reached his corner at 2:27 a.m. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant drone overhead. She glanced at the oxygen saturation number and her entire body went still. 88%. Dropping. His breathing had changed. Not the slow mechanical rise and fall she'd documented at midnight. This was rapid. Shallow. His chest wall moving asymmetrically, the right side barely moving at all while his left expanded and contracted like he was trying to breathe for both sides. The accessory muscles in his neck were working. His shoulders rising with each labored breath. Katie had seen this pattern once before, in a makeshift trauma tent outside Fallujah with rounds hitting the sandbags and a Marine with a sucking chest wound who couldn't catch his breath no matter how much oxygen they pushed through the vent. Tension pneumothorax. She didn't call for help. Not yet. She pulled his chart and read through the afternoon notes with the intensity of someone reading an autopsy report. Chest X-ray at 1,600 hours showed no pneumothorax. No effusion. Clear bilateral lung fields. Hargrove had documented it himself in careful handwriting. And then nothing. No orders for repeat imaging. No plan for what would happen if the patient deteriorated overnight. Just the assumption that a man with combat injuries and compromised lung tissue would simply stay stable because the chart said he was. Katie looked at his face. Master Sergeant James Chen. 53 years old. Tikrit, 2009. Commander of the Forward Operating Base Security Detail. The man who'd personally escorted her son's Humvee out of the city when Danny was medevaced with a through-and-through leg wound. She could still see Chen's face in the photograph Danny kept, older now, scarred along the left temple from shrapnel, but unmistakably the same man. His oxygen was dropping. 86% now. His body was telling her what the X-ray couldn't see. Air in the pleural space. Pressure building. Compressing the lung. And if she waited for the code team, if she waited for Hargrove to arrive and dismiss her concerns again, if she waited for protocol and orders and the careful bureaucracy of a hospital at 2:51 a.m., this man would code. His heart would stop. And everyone would say it was the Tikrit injuries, the complications, the inevitable result of old trauma. But Katie knew better. She knew because her hands had done this before in a combat surgical shelter with insurgent fire so close the concussions from the impacts made the tent fabric bow inward. She'd learned tension pneumothorax from a trauma surgeon named Mercer, Captain Daniel Mercer, Delta Force attached to her unit, who taught her the technique on a training dummy in the sand and then let her do it on a real patient when the real doctor was already dead. She moved. The supplies were in the crash cart. She knew exactly where because she'd restocked it 3 days ago: 14-gauge angiocath needle, alcohol swabs, occlusive dressing. Her hands were steady as she pulled the alcohol pad and prepped the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. This was anatomy. This was math. Pressure point here. Lung underneath. Air pocket above. 1 millimeter of difference and she'd hit his heart. But her hands had threaded needles through the dark with only a red-filtered headlamp and the sound of enemy fire echoing off canyon walls. She could do this. The needle went in. There was a moment of resistance, tissue, bone maybe, and then the hiss. The sound of air escaping. The sound of pressure releasing. The sound of death retreating by 30 seconds. Katie's breath didn't change. Her pulse didn't spike. She was somewhere else now, somewhere outside herself, in that state that operators called the zone. Where time moved differently and the body moved on its own and the conscious mind became a passenger watching her hands work. She secured the catheter with tape and stepped back. The monitor showed his oxygen climbing already. 89%. 92%. His breathing slowed. His shoulders relaxed. The accessory muscles stopped their frantic work. His body knew it could breathe again. 95%. Stable. 97%. Secure. She was still holding the needle when Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway at 2:51 a.m., still in his clothes from the day before, hair disheveled, eyes moving from Chen's monitor to Katie's hands. The catheter was still in place. The tape was still wet. The occlusive dressing was still being settled into position. Hargrove's face moved through surprise to anger to something darker, a calculation happening behind his eyes, an assessment of how much damage she'd done to him by succeeding where he would have failed. He didn't speak. He simply turned and walked out. But that wasn't the worst part. By 6:41 a.m., Katie's locker had been broken into. By 7:11 a.m., her access badge had been deactivated. By 8:15 a.m., she was called to the administrator's office. The door was already locked from the inside. She could see through the glass, Dr. Hargrove and Administrator Walsh and a hospital attorney with a leather folder already open on the desk like a surgical kit laid out before the operation begins. Walsh gestured for her to sit. Katie remained standing. The attorney slid a document across the desk. Termination letter. Single-spaced. Professional letterhead. 2 paragraphs of language so carefully constructed that it made the act of saving a life sound like criminal negligence. Performance of invasive procedures outside the scope of nursing licensure. Failure to await physician authorization. Violation of hospital protocol regarding chain of command. The letter was signed by Dr. Hargrove and dated 6:33 a.m. Before she'd even finished her shift. Katie read it without moving her face. The words moved past like text on a screen she wasn't really watching. Her eyes tracked the letterhead, the date, the official seal, but her mind was somewhere else, calculating the exit routes from the hospital, the bus schedule, the 1-bedroom apartment in the Starland district that took month-to-month rentals and didn't ask too many questions. Walsh cleared her throat. Your nursing license will be suspended pending investigation by the state board. That's a formal proceeding. You'll receive a notice with a hearing date. Katie said nothing. The decision is final, the attorney added. We've discussed potential liability, and the hospital's position is clear. Katie reached for the pen and signed her name. Catherine Marie Rodriguez. Not Katie. Not the carefully constructed identity of the quiet new nurse from Jacksonville. Catherine. The name she'd given up 18 years ago when she'd chosen to be small enough to fit in a classroom with her son instead of large enough to hold a rifle and a radio and the weight of people who depended on her not to hesitate. Hargrove watched her sign and something in his face released, like a man who'd been holding his breath and finally found permission to breathe. He'd made the call at 3:48 a.m. His brother-in-law Richard on the board. His contact at the State Nursing Oversight Committee. His investigator with the promise of 2 days and a retainer. The machinery was in motion. By this afternoon, there would be official inquiries. By tomorrow, there would be questions about her credentials, her background, her military service that she'd never mentioned and couldn't defend because the moment you started explaining, you started revealing. Hargrove had outsmarted her. He'd seen her vulnerability and exploited it with the precision of someone who'd spent years learning how to destroy people who threatened him. He'd taken her greatest strength, her training, her ability to act without hesitation, and transformed it into her greatest liability. And now he was untouchable, because she'd violated protocol, and the hospital's attorney had the email trail to prove it, and everything else would be buried under layers of institutional protection. Security escorted her to her locker at 9:15 a.m. The other nurses didn't look up. The ones who'd avoided her the day before, the ones Hargrove had systematically isolated her from, didn't speak as she packed her things. The cracked coffee mug with the faded Marine Corps logo that she'd used every morning without anyone asking where it came from. The dying succulent on the shelf, a gift from Danny 2 years ago, the only plant she'd ever managed to keep alive despite her attempts to neglect it. The photograph. The one photo she'd allowed herself. 3 teammates in full combat gear standing in front of an MH6 Little Bird on the tarmac at Bagram. Their faces covered by balaclavas but their shoulders unmistakable, wide and scarred and belonging to men who'd learned to carry things heavier than weapons. And at the bottom of the locker, wrapped in a hospital towel, the combat boots from Tikrit. The boots were worn through at the heel. The sole was cracked. The laces were still caked with dust from a city that had been rebuilt 3 times since she'd left it, dust that had never fully come clean despite 18 months of living in a place where dust meant something different, slower, less sinister, just the ordinary decay of coastal Georgia in the heat. She'd kept those boots hidden in a locker at the gym, then buried in a storage unit, then finally brought them here and placed them at the bottom of her work locker behind her spare scrubs, the one place no one would think to look. Not because she wanted to remember. Because she couldn't forget. Scars told stories, and so did boots, and the boots from Tikrit told a story that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez couldn't afford to have anyone read. She carried the cardboard box through the lobby of Mercy General at 9:02 a.m. 12 staff members watched. The ones who'd clustered around her 2 days ago when she was still the new nurse with steady hands. The ones who'd scattered like birds the moment she'd challenged Hargrove. The ones who'd made themselves small and useful and safe by never questioning authority. None of them spoke. No one called after her. No one said goodbye. The elevator doors closed and the box was still intact, though the bottom was already beginning to soften from the humidity. She could feel the weight shifting. The coffee mug sliding. The photo slipping. The boots pressing against the cardboard like they were trying to escape. She'd carried heavier things than this. She'd carried wounded men down mountain passes at altitude. She'd carried classified information that could have ended careers if it got into the wrong hands. She'd carried a secret about her son's survival through 2 years of his civilian life without cracking. But the weight of this cardboard box felt like it was going to break her. The rain started as she reached the bus stop on Victory Drive. Not a light rain. Not a cautious rain. It was the kind of rain that comes down like punishment, like the sky was trying to drown everything small and helpless on the ground. Katie stood under the shelter with the box growing heavier with water. The cardboard darkening. The edges beginning to collapse inward. She'd brought one small towel to wrap the boots. It wasn't enough. She sat on the bench and waited for the bus that wouldn't arrive for another 42 minutes according to the schedule, and she didn't cry, because crying would have meant that Hargrove had broken something, and the one thing she'd learned in Tikrit was that the enemy wins the moment you let him believe he's succeeded in breaking you. But the rain kept coming. The bus shelter smelled like wet concrete and diesel exhaust. Katie sat on the bench, the cardboard box balanced on her knees, rain drumming against the metal roof like mortar fire on a tin roof. 42 minutes until the next bus. She didn't move. The box was light, everything that mattered fit in a box the size of a showbox. A cracked coffee mug with a Navy SEAL trident painted on the side. A dying succulent that hadn't seen sunlight in 3 weeks. A photograph, her in full combat gear, 2009, Tikrit, standing shoulder to shoulder with 4 men whose names she couldn't speak and whose deaths she still heard at 3 a.m. And at the bottom, wrapped in a hospital blanket she'd stolen, the boots. Caked with Iraqi dust that no amount of scrubbing had ever fully removed. Rubber soles worn smooth from 1,000 miles of patrol. The leather creased at the ankles from years of jump boots and desert heat. Those boots had carried her through 4 ambushes, 2 IED detonations, and 18 combat saves. Those boots were the only proof that Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez had ever existed. She'd hidden them for 2 years. Now everyone knew. The rain intensified. A businessman hurried past without looking at her, his umbrella angled like a shield. Katie didn't flinch. Rain was just water. She'd sat through monsoons in Helmand Province with her jacket soaked through and her breath fogging in the cold, watching for movement in the darkness. This was nothing. Just a woman with a box on a bus bench in Savannah. Just another person the city would forget by tomorrow. She got off the bus at Maple Street and walked the 3 blocks to her apartment. The stairwell smelled like someone else's cooking, garlic and cumin mixing with bleach. She climbed to the 3rd floor, her wet shoes leaving marks on each step like a trail of evidence. Her hands were steady when she unlocked the door. Steady when she set the box on the kitchen table. Steady when she sat down and stared at it for 20 minutes without moving. The apartment was small. 1 bedroom, a living room with a couch that didn't recline, a kitchen with appliances that belonged to 1998. On the wall, a calendar from Mercy General, November 2024, with her shifts marked in blue pen. Most of them crossed out now. At 3 o'clock, she heard Danny's key in the lock. Her son was 19. 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, with her dark eyes and his father's jawline. He went to Savannah Tech, majored in engineering, came home on Tuesdays and Thursdays when he didn't have late classes. Today was Tuesday. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the box. "Mom, what happened?" His voice carried the same tone it did when he was 8 years old and she'd come home with a burn on her forearm. Worried. Searching her face for the answer she wouldn't give. "I got fired." Katie's voice was flat. The voice of someone reporting a weather forecast. "Lost my job today." Danny set his backpack down slowly. "For what?" "For saving a man's life." She didn't elaborate. She wouldn't. The details belonged to a part of her that Danny was never supposed to meet. He came closer. He saw the box. Really saw it. The way his mother's shoulders curved slightly inward as he approached, not defensive, just the posture of someone who'd learned to take up less space. His eyes moved from the mug to the plant to the photograph, and Katie watched his pupils dilate just slightly as he recognized the uniform. "Mom, are those?" Danny's voice changed. Younger suddenly. Uncertain. He pointed at the boots in the box, now visible because the blanket had shifted. Katie closed the box quickly. The photograph disappeared. The boots vanished. "It's nothing. Old work gear." "That's not work gear." Danny's hands were fists now. Small fists, the knuckles white. "Mom, are those military boots?" "Danny, you said you worked desk jobs. Before nursing school, you said you worked desk jobs." His voice was rising. Not angry. Confused. Hurt in a way that made Katie's chest tighten. "Why did you lie to me?" Katie stood up. Walked to the window. Savannah was grey today, the Spanish moss hanging from the oaks like cobwebs, dripping with rain. Every person on the street was a ghost. Every car that passed was someone who didn't know her name. "I didn't lie to you," she said quietly. "I just didn't tell you everything. Those are combat boots. I've seen them on the soldiers who came to school for career day." "Are you military?" Danny was moving around her now, trying to see her face. Trying to make her look at him. "Mom, are you military?" Katie closed her eyes. The rain sounded like automatic weapon fire if she listened long enough. Like rounds hitting sandbags. Like the rhythmic percussion of a military helicopter in the distance. Like every loud noise that used to send her diving for cover, hands shaking, certain that she was about to die. That was why she'd chosen the night shift at Mercy General. That was why she'd moved to Savannah, a quiet city where people whispered in hospitals and car horns were rare and the world was soft. She'd needed soft. She'd needed silence. Katie said. Her voice was different now, lower, older, the voice that belonged to someone else. A long time ago. For how long? 12 years. She turned to face him. Danny was holding the box now, holding the evidence of his mother's invisible life. 3 tours. The last one ended in 2012. Danny's jaw tightened. The same jaw she saw in the mirror sometimes, the family signature. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because every time you came home from basic, you'd talk about your sergeant, Master Sergeant Chen, how he could predict enemy movement like he could read minds, how he made sure every man in your platoon came home intact." And I remembered him. Katie sat back down. The chair scraped against the tile with a sound like nails on glass. I remembered serving with him. I remembered watching his back while he watched mine. I remembered that he was good people in a job that destroys good people. Mom. And I couldn't be that person anymore, Danny. I left the Navy because I couldn't handle the noise anymore. Every loud noise felt like incoming fire. Every crowd felt like an ambush. Every door slamming felt like mortars landing. She was looking at her hands now, the calluses on her palms, the old scar tissue on her right knuckle. Hands that had held weapons. Hands that had held wounded men. Hands that had learned to forget what they'd done. So I came here. I became a nurse. I became quiet. I became someone new. Danny didn't speak. He was looking at the photograph, the younger version of his mother with a rifle slung across her chest and 4 men who'd probably died in his place. Who died so that he could come home from his own deployment alive. Who died so that he could sit in this kitchen with his mother and ask questions she'd spent 2 years avoiding. "You saved Master Sergeant Chen today," Danny said finally. His voice was steady, the way hers had been. Like mother, like son. "Didn't you?" Katie nodded. "That's why they fired you. That's why they fired me." Danny opened the box again. He lifted the boots out of the blanket. They were heavier than they looked, still stiff from the desert, still holding the shape of feet that had run across Tikrit and Helmand and Sanjin. The dust inside the crevices was real. The dust was Iraq. The dust was Afghanistan. The dust was every moment she'd spent trying to forget. "You need to tell people," Danny said. "You need to tell them who you are." "No." Katie's voice was sharp. The command voice. The voice that made soldiers move. "I'm done with all that. I'm done with the uniform, done with the recognition, done with being seen. I just want to be your mother. I just want to be quiet." But that night, at 10 o'clock, Katie's phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But her hands moved on their own, muscle memory, the habit of answering calls in the dark, the reflex of someone whose life had always depended on immediate response. The woman's voice was warm. Familiar in a way Katie couldn't immediately place. "Ms. Rodriguez? This is Sarah Chen. Sarah Chen Rodriguez, actually. Master Sergeant Chen's wife." Katie's breath caught. She didn't speak. "I don't know what happened today at the hospital, but my husband is alive because of you. He told me everything. How you recognized his condition. How you spoke up when the doctor wouldn't listen. How you performed a procedure that saved his life." Sarah's voice wavered. "He also told me you're Danny Rodriguez's mother. That Danny served under him in Tikrit. That Danny was one of his best soldiers." Katie was standing now, though she didn't remember standing. The apartment was dark except for the kitchen light. The box sat open on the table, the boots visible, the photograph staring upward like an accusation. "He wants to thank you," Sarah said. "He's still in the ICU, but he asked me to call. He said to tell you that he already did. When he brought your son home safe." Katie's voice broke for the first time in 2 years. Not a cry. Not a whimper. Just a fracture, a small crack in the armor. "Tell him he already did. He brought my son home." She hung up before Sarah could respond. Before she could say anything else. Before the conversation could become real. The next morning, a certified letter arrived with her termination notice. Nursing license suspended pending investigation. Full hearing scheduled in 60 days. The words blurred. Katie sat on her couch and held the letter without reading it again. She already knew what it said. She'd known since the moment Hargrove had called security. When Danny came home from class at 4 o'clock, he took one look at her face and didn't ask questions. He went to her bedroom to find fresh sheets, already knowing she'd been sleeping on the couch, already understanding that nightmares were easier to have in the open where they couldn't surprise you. He was inside the bedroom for 3 minutes. Then 4. Then 5. Katie heard him open the closet. Heard him kneel. Heard the cardboard box scrape against the hardwood floor as he pulled it down from the shelf where she'd hidden it beneath winter clothes she never wore. She didn't move. She didn't go to him. She just sat on the couch and listened to the sound of her son opening her past like a book in a language he was finally learning to read. She heard his breath change. Heard a small sound, not quite a gasp, not quite a whisper. Heard him pulling out the wooden box beneath the boots. The wooden box she'd forgotten about. The wooden box that held the only things that had mattered in Tikrit. The wooden box that held proof. She heard him pull out his phone. Heard the camera click once. Twice. 3 times. That was the moment everything changed. She just didn't know it yet. 2 days. That's how long it took for everything to collapse. Danny walked into Administrator Walsh's office without knocking, a showbox balanced in his hands like it contained something that might shatter. He was 19, broad-shouldered like his mother, with her eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen things. Walsh looked up from her desk, confused. Danny set the showbox down slowly, deliberately, the way someone sets down evidence. "My mom didn't tell you the truth," he said. "I found these when I was helping her pack. You need to see what you actually fired. Walsh opened the box. Inside, nested in faded velvet, were medals. Bronze. Purple. Silver. Each one was heavy with the weight of someone else's survival. Walsh's hand trembled as she lifted the first citation. Her face went white, not red, not angry. White. The color of understanding something irrevocable. The citation read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, Navy Special Warfare, 3 tours ticket embedded with Special Forces. Walsh couldn't finish reading. Her lips moved silently over the words. Her attorney walked in, saw her face, and immediately picked up the phone. Within 4 hours, the hospital's legal team had cross-referenced every medal, every date, every combat operation. They didn't call Hargrove. They called the Navy. And the Navy called someone else. On day 3, a SEAL team leader walked into Mercy General in civvies, jeans, a polo shirt, dog tags visible against his collarbone. His name was Commander Tyler Graves, call sign Hammer, and he'd served with Katie in Tikrit. He moved through the hospital with the terrifying fluid precision of someone trained to breach walls and end threats. He didn't look at the architecture or the equipment. He looked for Hargrove. They found him in his office. Hargrove's face went gray when Graves closed the door. You called to verify Senior Chief Rodriguez's military service, Graves said. His voice was flat. Uninflected. The kind of voice that comes after years of giving orders in places where hesitation killed people. Let me save you some time. Bronze Star with Valor for Medical Intervention under Direct Fire, Jolin District, April 2007. Graves paused. Each medal was its own sentence. Purple Heart. 2 of them. Shrapnel from an IED, bullet grazing that should have been fatal. Silver Star for leadership under sustained enemy contact. Joint Service Commendation for coordinating with Army Special Forces. 18 combat saves under fire. Graves stepped closer. I knew people fired her for saving a life. It wasn't a question. It was a command delivered in past tense, as if the outcome was already written in stone. Hargrove's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hand shook as he reached for his phone. Graves didn't move. He didn't need to. The air in the room had changed pressure. Hargrove could feel it. That night, in his desperation, Hargrove made his final move. He accessed the VA database using his credentials he still had because the hospital's IT department hadn't shut him down yet. His hands moved across the keyboard with the frantic energy of a man drowning. He altered Katie's service record. Changed her rank from Senior Chief Petty Officer to EB-4. Removed the Bronze Star, the Silver Star, the Joint Service Commendation. He inserted a falsified dishonorable discharge dated 2009. Fabricated psychiatric evaluations. His logic was simple: if he could prove she'd lied about her service, the termination was justified. If he could prove she was unstable, the needle decompression was recklessness. If he could prove she'd falsified her credentials, she'd never work again. What he didn't know was that the VA database is monitored by federal security. Every keystroke logged. Every alteration flagged. Within 30 seconds, an automated alert triggered at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. Within 2 hours, Special Agent Maria Ortiz at the FBI's Jacksonville field office had a file open on her desk. On day 3, at 8:27 a.m., 2 FBI agents arrived at Mercy General. Ortiz was lean, with silver hair and eyes like a courtroom prosecutor, sharp enough to cut through any lie. Her partner, Agent James Kim, carried a folder thick enough to hold an entire career's worth of crimes. They walked past the nurses' station where Sharon and Miguel looked up from their charts. They walked past the unit board where Hargrove's disciplinary write-up still hung, edges curling. They walked past Master Sergeant Chen's room, where Chen watched them move down the corridor with the practiced awareness of a soldier who reads threats in body language. They found Hargrove in his office, packing a box. Dr. James Hargrove, Ortiz said. You're under arrest for falsifying federal military documents under 18 U.S. Code Section 1001. The color drained from his face in stages. Red to white to something worse, the color of understanding that he'd committed a federal crime. I was verifying information for hospital safety, he said. His voice had lost all its authority. She could have been lying about. You attempted to alter a decorated service member's official records in a federal database, Kim said flatly. That's a felony. The handcuffs clicked closed. Steel on skin. The perp walk happened at 9:15 a.m. They didn't escort him out the back. Federal protocol, public arrest, public consequence. Ortiz and Kim walked him through the main corridor, handcuffs visible, his white coat removed, his hand shackled in front of everyone who'd seen him humiliate a nurse 2 weeks earlier. The nurse's station froze. Sharon's hand went to her mouth. Miguel set down his pen. Beth whispered something to the resident beside her. Hargrove didn't look at them. He looked straight ahead, eyes unfocused, as if disconnecting from his body might make the reality stop. They passed Master Sergeant Chen's room. Chen was sitting up in bed, his prosthetic leg resting against the frame. His wife stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder. When Chen saw Hargrove's face through the window, something shifted in his expression, not satisfaction, something else. Respect for the gravity of consequence. Outside, news cameras were already there. Someone from the hospital had tipped them off. Or maybe the FBI had. It didn't matter. The headline was already being written in real time, Chief of Medicine arrested after falsifying war heroes' records following firing. The State Medical Board held an emergency hearing on day 5. Hargrove arrived with his attorney, who said nothing. The board chairman, a woman named Dr. Felicia Nguyen with 30 years in medicine, read the findings without emotion. Your attempt to falsify a service member's military records represents a betrayal of this profession's fundamental oath. You have violated the trust of patients, colleagues, and the broader medical community. Your medical license is hereby revoked, effective immediately. You are permanently barred from practicing medicine in the state of Florida, Georgia, and any state with reciprocity agreements with this board. Hargrove sat alone at the defendant's table. No colleagues came to support him. No fellow physician sent letters of character reference. Even his brother-in-law, Richard Chen, had recused himself from every discussion. The hospital board had voted unanimously to terminate his employment and cooperate fully with federal investigators. When he walked out of the hearing, there were no cameras waiting. No news vans. His arrest had been the story. His punishment was just the expected ending. 6 months later, Katie Rodriguez stood in the Pentagon in full dress uniform, dress blues with ribbons arranged precisely above her left breast. Her son Danny stood beside her in a suit, his hand gripping her shoulder. Around them, the ballroom was full of active duty personnel, admirals, senior enlisted, and families. The ceremony had been delayed for years. Katie's Navy Cross citation was approved long after her discharge, lost in administrative backlogs and paperwork shuffles. Now it was being corrected. Commander Price, a full-bird captain with a voice like authority itself, read the citation for extraordinary heroism while serving as senior chief petty officer with Special Forces elements in Tikrit, Iraq, during combat operations from March 2007 to August 2009. Senior Chief Rodriguez repeatedly exposed herself to enemy fire to provide life-saving medical treatment to wounded personnel. Despite sustaining injuries, she continued to perform her duties with unwavering courage and dedication. Her selfless actions directly resulted in the survival of 18 service members who would otherwise have perished. Her courage and dedication reflect the highest traditions of naval service. The medal was pinned to her uniform. Katie's hands were steady. Her eyes focused forward. No trembling. No tears. Just the composure of someone who'd been through worse and refused to let this moment break her. Danny's hand tightened on her shoulder. In the audience, Master Sergeant Chen stood from his seat, his prosthetic leg supporting him as he came to attention. His salute was crisp, precise. His wife and daughter stood beside him, tears running freely, but Chen's face was composed, the face of a soldier honoring a superior officer. When the ceremony ended, Katie walked through the Pentagon corridors in dress uniform, Danny beside her. The silence around her was different now. People recognized the Navy Cross. They stepped back. They stood straighter. They saluted. After 18 months of being invisible, Katie Rodriguez had become impossible to ignore. Back in Savannah, Administrator Walsh approved a proposal that same week. In the main lobby of Mercy General, they installed a bronze plaque beneath a framed Navy Cross citation. It read, "In honor of Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, RN, who taught us that true healing requires both skill and courage. May we never again mistake strength for insubordination or wisdom for overreach." The nursing staff gathered for a photo beneath it. Sharon, Miguel, and Beth stood in the frame, their faces expressions of quiet shame and recognition. The photo was sent to every hospital system in Georgia as part of their mandatory ethics training, recognizing hidden competence. In a strip mall in a declining part of Savannah, in a space that had once housed a failed tax preparation service, Dr. James Hargrove, now Kevin, just Kevin, no title, sat at a folding table beside a banner that read "Supplemental Insurance, Ask Kevin." His nameplate was plastic, the kind you could buy at an office supply store. No credentials listed. No degrees mentioned. No authority implied. Just a name. A customer walked past without stopping. Hargrove's phone buzzed with a news notification, Navy Cross Ceremony Honor Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez. He turned the phone face down without reading the full headline. 6 months later, Katie returned to Mercy General. Not as a nurse in the rotation. As a clinical instructor. She stood in the break room where she'd sat alone and crying, except she hadn't cried, had she? She'd breathed. She'd let one tear escape. She'd wiped it and continued. That was the difference between breaking and surviving. A young nurse named Sarah, fresh from her nursing program, asked, "Chief Rodriguez, how do you stay calm under pressure?" Katie pulled out the pair of worn combat boots from her bag. Iraqi dust still caked the treads, still visible in the seams, still there after all these years. She set them on the table between them. "These remind me that the fight isn't always where you expect it," Katie said. "Sometimes it's in a hospital room where a doctor won't listen. Sometimes it's sitting alone in the rain with everything you own in a cardboard box. But you show up anyway. You keep your hand steady. You trust your training. You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." Sarah looked at the boots. At the woman standing before her. At the Navy Cross citation hanging in the lobby visible through the break room window. "Will you teach us what you know?" Sarah asked. Katie picked up the boots and nodded once. "If you've made it this far, you understand what Katie Rodriguez understood. True strength is quiet until it has to speak, and when it speaks, the world listens." Subscribe to see more stories of hidden strength and public reckoning. Like this video if you believe competence should never be confused with insubordination. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value? Her story doesn't end here.